This is how I come up with a dungeon from scratch. The first thing that I do is I pick a theme and then I brainstorm around that theme. I use a very specific brainstorming method that I came up with myself, and I've made a video on that brainstorming method. It works really well, and I encourage you to check out the video and try out the brainstorming method for yourself. One of the things that I love about this brainstorming method is that essentially each line of the page can become a dungeon room in and of itself. So when it comes time to stock the dungeon, I already have a list of ideas that I really like, and I know where I want to go with it. The theme that I've picked for this dungeon is a lake. This dungeon is centered near a lake, and the first layer of the dungeon I'm envisioning as a cave system. And I'll talk about how to map and how to make a cave system when I get to the mapping part. But I'm finishing up the brainstorming method right now, and all I'm doing is crossing off a couple ideas that don't really appeal to me or that might be redundant, so that I'm left with my favorite ideas. After I brainstorm the ideas, I come up with some unique monsters, spells, traps, treasures, etc. Things that you won't find in the rulebook to keep your players on your toes. I'm just doing monsters and treasures right now, but like I said, spells, traps, or other heroes you might find within the dungeon can all be candidates for coming up with independently. As far as monsters go, the easiest method I've found is to just reskin monsters and add an ability here or there. So for example, my snail men are just regular men, but they have an acidic slime attack, and the crab men are goblins, but they have big claws. By them being goblins, I don't mean they are literally goblins, but they use the stat line of goblins, but they're crab men. I'm also coming up with some unique treasures, and when I come up with a treasure, I usually come up with how it can help you and a drawback. These treasures are going to be placed in the dungeon independent of random treasure tables, as well as some layers of the monsters that I've come up with, or if I want to use a monster from the monster manual, I also might come up with a layer for it and place it in the dungeon independent of randomly generating. In fact, the rulebook does suggest that you begin your dungeon stalking by placing monsters and treasure independently. After I come up with the unique monsters, I write my own wandering monster list. I use a combination of unique monsters and monsters from the monster manual. That way, it's not completely alien to my players, but it's not completely the same either. It helps keep your players on your toes. Helps keep your players on their toes without being boring. Excuse me. I typically also like to make an entry on each floor that you'll roll on the next floor as well. That way you can generate out-of-depth monsters and keep things a little dangerous. You'll notice that I'm coming up with multiple floors at once. When making a new dungeon, the rulebook suggests to come up with at least 3 floors, and I think 3 is a pretty good number. Although if you're completely new to refereeing and your players are new, it might just be appropriate to come up with only 1 or 2. After I've come up with the monsters, I'm going to come up with some factions for the dungeon. Of course, I have a video on how to create factions for your dungeon, and I highly encourage you to go check that one out. When I'm coming up with factions, I'm thinking about the treasures that I have in the dungeon, as well as some potential layers that my dungeon could have. It gives character to the dungeon, and for a 3-floor dungeon, I think about 5 factions, maybe 6 is appropriate. Once you have more than 2 factions per floor, it can feel pretty crowded. Of course, that's going to depend on how big your dungeon floors are, and I'll talk about how big to make each dungeon floor and how many rooms in the next section. I'm just finishing up my factions, and now I'm moving on to mapping out the dungeon. And for mapping out the dungeon, I'm using Appendix A of the AD&D DMG. You can use whatever random dungeon making method you prefer, but I like Appendix A. Delta of Delta's D&D hotspot has come up with some good modifications to make to Appendix A to make it go a little smoother, and I'll link that in the description. As I mentioned before, I do want this to eventually be a natural cave system, but for right now, I'm just generating a dungeon as I normally would, and then I'll go back after I'm done with this and do a pass over it and freehand it into looking more like a cave system. I found that that's the easiest way to generate natural-looking cave systems. By using Appendix A, I am going to come up naturally with a dungeon that has a lot of branches and loops, but when you're done making your dungeon floor, you might want to give it a once-over and connect a couple rooms here and there, maybe using secret doors, ramps, or things of that nature to make sure that your dungeon is completely interconnected. As I'm mapping this dungeon, I'm also keeping an eye out for potential areas that could turn into lairs. And as I'm working at this northeast corner of the dungeon, it's generating a lot of rooms pretty close together, and it looks pretty defensible, so I think that this is a good spot to put a lair, and I'm thinking about putting my crabmen lair in here, which I will do later. I'm using a grid of about 4 squares per inch, but you could use 5 squares per inch or even 10 squares per inch if you want a very large dungeon floor. You'll also notice that I'm using the back of the sheet. I'll explain why I do that in a moment when I talk about dungeon stocking. As you can see, I've gone back over it and turned it into more of a cave system. Now what I'm doing is I'm laying another sheet over this sheet. This will become dungeon level 2. The reason I lay it over is so that I can put the staircases in the same spot. So a staircase leading down on floor 1 becomes a staircase leading up on floor 2. This can help my players if they're mapping carefully so they can get an idea of where they are in the dungeon. I finished up the second floor, and I'm also showing off a potential third floor. The reason that I'm putting the maps on the back of the sheet is because I put the key on the front of the sheet. That way I can come up with a 2-page spread that's very easy to put in a 3-ring binder. The first thing I'm doing is keying out the dungeon lair that I mentioned earlier. I think a good first step for keying a dungeon is to put the independently placed lairs and treasure, the ones that are not dependent on the dice. So here I'm putting my crabmen lair and dividing them into dormitory, chieftain's quarters, etc. And you'll notice that I'm also putting the stat line of the crabmen in the key as well, so that I don't have to flip back and forth to reference things and I can just have it on my spread. I've rolled the number appearing in their lair, and as I'm stocking each room, I'm just pulling from that total. So I started off with 27 crabmen, but I've shuffled them around so some of them are in one room and some of them are another, but there's a total of 27 crabmen. And now I'm adding randomly generated treasure as well as the treasure I've independently decided on, which is the magic conch shell. The next thing I'm keying is an independently placed feature. This is from my brainstorming sheet, the giant pit, that I've decided to use like a staircase that connects the first layer to the second and the third layer as well. The next thing I'm doing is randomly generating some treasure, traps, monsters, etc. in accordance with the rules. I'm also keeping track of how much treasure I have total on this floor. I'm going to shoot for about 5,000 GP worth of treasure on this first floor, since it's a bit of a smaller floor. I did intentionally make this floor a little smaller because it's just a demonstration, but I could easily have a floor with twice as many rooms and still have room to key it on this second page. I'm using a lot of room on this second page for my key because I know it's a small dungeon, but I'll definitely be more truncated if I have a larger dungeon that I'm keying. I'm simply rolling the 2d6 and assigning empty, trap, monster, special, etc. in accordance with the rules, and then I'm going back and I'm looking at my brainstorming sheet and using my brainstorming sheet to decide what is going to go into those rooms specifically. Always use your brainstorming sheet. For example, I'm using quicksand for my brainstorming sheet as a trap. I'm using my Wandering Monsters table to stock these monster rooms as well, and then randomly generating treasure to go with those monsters. I find that outside of independently placed treasure, you're going to have an average of about 255 GP per room on the first floor, and about twice that on the second floor, etc. All told, your randomly generated treasure plus your pre-generated treasure should add up to the total that you're shooting for. For a large first floor of about 16 to 20 rooms, that might be anywhere from 8,000 to 10,000 GP for floor 1. But like I said, for a smaller floor like this, I'm going to only go for about 5,000 GP. And you can see here I'm demonstrating the ease of use that a 2-page spread gives you. I've also written the Wandering Monsters table on the key. You don't have to do this, but I had room, so I thought, why not? Otherwise, I'll probably put my Wandering Monsters table on my referee screen. In order to allow my dungeon descriptions to fit on one page for my key, I have to keep them very short. This can create a bit of a problem if I'm coming back to my key after a long time away and I've forgotten what I was thinking when I was writing the key in the first place. In order to combat this, I take a document file and I write out long-form descriptions of each room. This is not something that I'd necessarily read out to my players or maybe even reference during play, but it's something I can look over before the session or use as a reference so that I know everything I was thinking when I was making the dungeon. I'll also include a brief player background that I can read out loud to players before the first session, and a dungeon master background full of the lore of my dungeon and tons of spoilers so that I have it all written down in one place. I hope that this video has been helpful to you, and I hope that this method works really well for you. I'd love it if you tried it out for yourself and showed me the dungeon that you made, and let me know what you liked about this method. Thank you guys so much.